Your vocals are noisy. I'm talking about hum from your fridge, air conditioner, or other electronics in your room, hiss from recording in an open space with a condenser mic that's gain staged too loudly, or background noise like headphone bleed and movement that you didn't notice when you were performing, but now you hear all of these problems clear as day and you desperately need to find a way to fix them. I've had to deal with this too as an engineer recording in less than ideal environments and mixing for artists who record themselves. So, in today's video, we're going to go over 4 strategies to conquer hiss, hum, and other unwanted background noise on your vocal recordings. This is 5-piece, by the way, and in today's video, I'm going to be using the song Ogwula by my friends Four Corners and Everything Ocean. Let's start with the first strategy, which is editing. There's some headphone bleed that's happening between parts of the performance that we probably don't want. Take a listen. Now you can hear the headphone bleed in general, but especially during moments like this when he stops rapping and it's really just the background noise taking place while he's waiting to perform his next line. Now to be fair, I'm not only dealing with headphone bleed on this track, but also a lingering ambience, maybe a reverb that's actually been printed to the audio. So what we could do to help reduce the noticeability of this is we can go in and we could grab a moment of the vocal performance, at least when his vocal stops happening and where there's a gap in that performance, we could crop it out and then we can remove it and then apply a crossfade for a nice and smooth and seamless transition. For example, now this might appear more noticeable right now and I have the vocal soloed, but if I take it out of solo mode and play it, you shouldn't notice this as much. Right, we didn't notice that gap at all, especially because it was being covered up by some additional elements that are taking place in the instrumental. Now, while I've done this to treat a gap in the vocal performance, you could do the same thing if you have a track that has a noticeable hum or hiss sound on it. So for example, you could hear the hum, but you can also actually see it visually. You can see there's just something statically happening here, whereas on this other track, it's dead quiet. So what we could do is we can go in and crop these moments and then delete them, apply a crossfade and do the exact same thing, but be a lot more meticulous, making sure that we get it throughout the entire track. So that way there is none of this hum happening, at least not when there's any vocal performance. Now, of course, the hum or even hiss that's being applied while the vocal is being performed, that's going to require a different solution that we're going to talk about in a moment, but at least you know you could clean it up and really tighten it and focus it at least on just the vocal alone and get rid of as much of the noise as possible by manually editing. Let's face facts though, all this editing can be tedious work, especially if you have many tracks spanning 2, 3, or 4 minutes long, maybe even longer than that. And that's obviously going to require some finesse as well. You're not only going to be deleting these moments and cropping them out, but you're also going to need to apply some crossfading to make sure that they transition smoothly. Otherwise, these things are going to sound very abrupt and cut off. So what's a faster and more efficient way to achieve the same thing? I would suggest using a gate, of course. A gate is a dynamic tool that can automatically reduce the volume of any part of a signal that isn't loud enough to pass a threshold. So in this case, we could set up a gate to reduce the volume of the vocal audio when the vocal itself is no longer being performed. This would reduce or remove the gaps between the vocal performance that we just discussed manually editing in that previous step. So let's explore how we could set up a gate to help us in this scenario, and for that I'm going to be using Standard Gate, a plugin from the sponsor of this video, Sir Audio Tools, but more on that in a moment. The first thing we should do with the gate is increase the threshold to the highest setting. Until the signal, in this case the vocal, passes the threshold, it's going to be muted, and at this setting, regardless of all the other parameters we can affect, we're not going to be able to hear the vocal. It's going to stay muted until it passes this level, and chances are it is not loud enough to do so. Once that's done, we can set the time parameters as well. These will ultimately determine how the gate will react to the signal once the threshold has been breached. Once the signal is loud enough to pass the threshold, how is the gate exactly going to react and let the signal through, and what's it going to sound like? On this plugin, the time parameters are the attack, the hold, and release. I like to start with the following settings. The attack will be set to the fastest setting. That way the gate opens right away once the signal passes the threshold. This will help prevent any consonants from being cut off if the vocalist starts at a lower volume before fully projecting their voice. If they're starting starting at a lower voice, there's the potential that it may not pass the gate, or if it has a slower attack time that the gate won't let it through. With a quick attack time, we're not going to run that risk. Similarly, the hold we're going to set to the fastest hold time. Basically, this means that the hold is not going to hold at all. It's not going to keep the gate open. It's going to close it almost right away, or at least it's going to be dependent on the release to do so. Finally, the release will also be set to the fastest time. That way, the gate doesn't linger and it closes fairly quickly when the signal falls below the threshold. We'll likely adjust these settings as they're fairly aggressive and they're likely going to lead to an abrupt gated sound, but let's at least start here. Let's now play the track and bring down the threshold, and as we bring it down, you're going to start to hear the actual vocal performance. Essentially, you need the threshold to be set roughly where the quietest part of your vocal is, but just louder than the in-between parts, those gaps in between the vocal phrases.
Dance to the money, gula, dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula, dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula, dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula.
So we can now hear that the gate is letting through the main parts of the vocal performance, but it is muting the gaps in between. It's exactly what we wanted. However, this whole thing, it could be tighter. So I'm going to adjust the time settings to try to achieve a slightly more transparent sound.
Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula.
So you can hear how this is starting to create a much smoother sound. It's not as abrupt as it initially was with our original settings. It's still not perfect, but it's much better than where it was when we initially started. Now, one of the coolest features with this standard gate plugin is that it has a tolerance function. A common problem with gates is that they chatter, okay? That's when a gate intermittently opens and closes if a sound is just close enough to the threshold.
Dance to the money, gula.
Standard gate's tolerance feature helps mitigate and reduce this issue, allowing sounds that are still within range of a threshold to pass through and not be closed on. So for example, if I play this and we adjust the tolerance, you're going to hear how it changes the signal.
Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula.
Right? So you heard when I actually brought the tolerance down lower, it actually let through more of the noise. In this case, we don't want that. But you can understand how this actually could be useful. So for example, I actually might be able to increase the threshold, so make the threshold higher, but then have the tolerance be a little bit lower than where it is. And what might happen is it actually might allow the quieter parts of our signal still get through. So as an example, those early consonants at the beginning of a phrase, but then it'll still clamp down and remove the noise. So let's actually do that together right now as well.
Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula. Dance till it gula. Dance to the money, gula.
That actually sounds even better, right? It's really, really tight now. You can hear how it's definitely getting rid of those in-betweens. There's still the odd moment of noise squeaking through simply because that's when Oshan is performing. He's performing the vocal. The noise is happening at the same time. It's not really going to be possible to get rid of that, right? You can see how big of a deal recording is in this situation. But with this setting, with a higher threshold plus the tolerance, it's allowing that quieter moment to get through with the vocal that we want, but then still minimizing the noise. Maybe even minimizing the noise more effectively than the original settings that I had. After spending a few weeks with this plugin, it's become my go-to gaining plugin. It's a very intuitive and functional tool that offers a lot of control over a sound with many features that you won't find anywhere else. I'm talking about things like the built-in sidechain that lets you sculpt exactly what you're going to affect frequency-wise. Or you could even go and look at an external source that will allow the gate to open up. I actually use this quite a bit to fatten up kick drums by stacking a sub bass underneath, for example. Or the detector circuit that it has built in that allows you to switch between peak, transient, percussive, and other modes, allowing you to create a more tailored approach to affecting a signal. Features like this are noticeably absent on other gate products out there, and this type of functionality is appreciated by somebody like me who uses a gate in every single mix that I do. So if you're interested in checking out Standard Gate or any of Sir Audio Tool's other plugin offerings, check out the link that I'll leave in the description below. Try a demo or even buy it if you like it, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about firsthand. So we've talked about dealing with noise that happens during the quiet moments of a vocal performance, such as between vocal phrases. But what if it's happening throughout the entire track? Something like a hum or a hiss that's just consistently playing alongside the vocal performance. Now, a gate could certainly minimize the effects of this, but it likely won't help this issue the same way other solutions will. In fact, even if a gate was able to clamp down and get rid of the noise in between vocal lines, when the actual vocal line passes the threshold and you hear it, you're still going to hear the hum. Everything is going through once that gate opens. So what should you do? How can you solve this specific issue? I would first look at something that we all have access to, being an EQ. Hum is usually found in the lower frequency range, almost near the bass or the muddy area, whereas hiss is found higher up in the frequency range, usually in the air band, for example. Let's first address fixing hum. For that, I've created this example which has a low hum around 70 Hz. Let's analyze that using this Pro Cue that I have set up on the track.
Dance till the money agula wo. Dance till the money agula wo.
Now you can see that there's a lot of energy around this 70 Hz area. I'm looking for that big peak that was happening here. And of course you saw a few, but we know that hum typically lives in the low end, so it could really only be a few options. Now that we know that it's roughly around 70 Hz in this case, and of course it's going to vary depending on your signal, I'm going to put a band there and I can actually solo the frequency to fully confirm what I'm listening for. So let's just double check this. I'll create a tighter cue, solo the frequency. Let's see if this is exactly the hum that we're talking about. Almost perfectly identified the hum in this scenario. You might need to use different tools. I'd absolutely recommend something like TDR Nova, which is a free dynamic EQ plugin. It has a visual analyzer. It also will allow you to solo the frequency. Very similar to the Pro Cue, but of course it's a free plugin that I recommend you guys check out if you don't have access to it. Now, once you've identified the hum, you can do one of two things. First of all, if it's in the low end like it is for me, if it's under 100 Hz, let's say on a vocal, you could go in and actually use a low cut filter. I am, of course, going to want to go just beyond 70 Hz because 70 Hz is really where it's concentrated. But by doing that, it should help reduce the impact of the hum. Let's check that out.
Dance till the money agula wo. Dance till the money agula wo. Dance till Dance to the money agula wo.
Now you still hear a bit of the hum, but if we put the track into context, you're likely not going to notice it as much as if I didn't have this EQ in. Now a key consideration with the filter is you don't want to overdo it. If you push it up too far, what's going to happen is your vocal is going to start to sound thin, since the low end is responsible for the warmth and the fullness of a vocal. So if you find that using a filter aggressively is thinning out your vocal, well then instead you're going to want to use maybe a bell curve rather than a filter, which might be a more transparent solution. So for example, I take this and I would turn it into a bell as opposed to the filter, and I would notch that frequency out with a pretty narrow cue, maybe even reducing it drastically. And let's play this and slowly reintroduce.
Dance till agula, dance to the money agula wo. Dance till agula, dance to the money agula wo. Dance till agula, dance to the money agula wo. Dance till agula, dance to the money agula wo. Dance till agula, dance to the money agula wo. Dance till agula, dance to the money agula wo. Dance till agula, Dance to the money, agula, oh.
That actually might be more transparent than using the filter, as you can see here. Now, it's possible that most of the hum is concentrated in one specific area, like 70 hertz here, for example. However, it's also likely that there are harmonics of that same frequency higher up that are also being affected by the hum. A harmonic is typically a multiple of a fundamental frequency. That means we could double 70 hertz each time to locate the other problematic frequencies that are being affected. Now, because hum typically lives solely in the low end, we don't have to go too high, so we're not going to grab any harmonics above 1000, but with 70 hertz being the main fundamental, we can now double it each time. So that means we're going to do 140, 280, and 560. And if I double 560, we're going to be going beyond 1000, so we're not going to grab that one. Instead, we're going to focus on these three. We may want to actually notch these three out, but be careful because, of course, the vocal, especially the warmth of the vocal, is going to be in this area. But all you're trying to do is take your main fundamental where the hum lives and duplicate it each time to locate the next fundamental in sequence. So with that being said, let's solo each of these and even narrow the cue and see what we're listening for. Not hearing too much there. Let's listen to the next one. Okay, let's do the final one. So you can hear there's still obviously the vocal there, but you still hear the hum, especially on this 560. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to notch them all out very aggressively, and I'm going to slowly reintroduce each one. Let's do them one at a time though. So I'm going to bypass these. Let's play this and reintroduce this one first.
Dance till the agula, dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula, dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh.
Still getting a slight presence of the hum. You can still hear it if you're really listening for it, but significantly less when I put this EQ in. So that's the approach I take with EQ for hum, but what about hiss? As I mentioned, hiss will usually be found higher up in the frequency range, typically above 10 kilohertz or even higher than that. So I've got another example here with hiss applied to it. This is something I've created, of course. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a high cut filter. And I'm going to bring this all the way to the right so we're not really removing anything below 30K in this case. And I'm going to slowly sweep this to the left. Now, here's the thing. We're not going to want to go too far. We're definitely not going to want to go to this 1 to 5K range because that 1 to 5K range is really where the vocal lives, the intelligibility lives, the main presence of it lives. So, of course, going that far is way too much. However, we're probably going to want to go to somewhere between 15 and 20K. Even that could be a lot depending on your vocal sound. But I think by going that far, we shouldn't drastically affect it, and we should hopefully minimize the presence of the hiss in this scenario. Let's try it.
Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh. Dance till the agula. Dance to the money, agula, oh.
Now you can hear when I pulled this lower, when I had it closer to 10 to 12, it was really starting to affect the vocal sound. It was starting to sound darker and the intelligibility was suffering as a result. However, when I pulled it up a little bit closer to this 17K in this scenario, it's still a little bit noticeable, but not so much. Now, similar to hum, hiss is not just in the top end, but it seems to affect frequencies that are even lower. And unlike hum, I don't like to go in with an EQ and remove lower harmonics, especially in that 1 to 5K area that I mentioned, because that can really affect the sound, the clarity, the intelligibility of the vocal, and I don't want to do that. So EQ is clearly not the best choice for this. The only option is to use a noise reduction plugin. I've recently been testing out Acon Digital's Denoise 2 here, which is what I'm going to be using in this scenario. Each of these plugins works in their own unique way, but the first thing you typically want to do is get the plugin to learn and identify exactly where the noise lives. I could do that by first turning on the noise profile of this plugin, and then finding a moment where the noise lives on its own. Now, in this case, I have a whole bunch of hiss playing here after my vocal performance, but if you're not so lucky, you're going to want to go in and find a quieter moment that just has hiss between your vocal takes. The more isolated the noise is, the better the result will be. So I'm going to grab down here just for safety, and then I'm going to press learn, and I'm going to just play this moment of noise, and we're going to see a profile develop. So with the noise profile defined, I've deselected the learn button, I've turned it on, and now you can actually see the noise profile that it's developed. That's what this yellow line is. If I can actually grab this area and I can increase the reduction, and we should be able to hear this processing work, we should actually hear significantly less, if not any noise at all. Right? We didn't hear anything, but let's play it again. Let me bypass this as I play it. Seems like it's identified the noise quite well, in fact, but now we have to actually make sure that this processing makes sense on the vocal. It's cool when it's just the noise isolated, but when the vocal is playing, this might sound very different. For example,
Dance till dance to the money, dance.
You can really hear the digital artifacts and texture that this plugin is imparting, and that's probably because I've pushed the reduction to the maximum level. So we're probably not going to want to do that. And as a pro tip with all noise reduction plugins, you typically don't want to go to the max setting. It's usually going to create this warbly digital sound that's not that desirable, and that definitely sounds unnatural. However, we could tell that it's actually working, and I could do that by even soloing the noise here and playing this exact section again, and we can actually hear exactly what it's isolating. So you can tell that it's not only grabbing some of the noise, but it's also grabbing some of the vocal articulation here, which is obviously not what we want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually reduce the reduction to the lowest possible setting and play this again and slowly introduce the reduction and try to find a middle ground where I'm able to get rid of the noise and achieve what I want, but without totally affecting the vocal in a negative way. Let's do that.
Dance till dance to the money, 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 dance to the money, dance till dance to the money,
It's definitely still got a little bit of hiss there, but less than we initially started with, which is a good thing. Now, while I have applied this plugin specifically to a track that has hiss on it, you could use this plugin and other noise reduction plugins similar to it, even on tracks for treating hum. It's a very similar process, just obviously focus more on a lower frequency. So it's worth checking these out if you're dealing with a lot of noise or if you're recording in a less than ideal environment. Now, this is one of many common mixing problems that you'll face when mixing vocals. And if you want to learn how to solve some of the most common vocal issues out there, click the video that I'm going to leave on the screen right now and check out the video before this one is done. It's going to be solving some of the most common problems that you guys will be dealing with in your tracks. If you got value out of this video, don't forget to smash that like button until it turns blue. And if you're new here, definitely subscribe to the channel so you can see some more of my helpful content. I appreciate you for watching once again, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.
5